Hello everyone, and welcome to our session on challenges for the LGBTQ community during COVID-19. My name is Genesis Garcia. I am a proud programming board member and on the board of advisors for StartOut. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today to host this conversation with some really amazing leaders. And I also want to thank our sponsor, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, for their support. So just some housekeeping items as people start joining before we kick off. I want to ask that everyone not speaking to please remain muted. And secondly, if you'd like to see all of the panelists on one screen, there is a way you can pin them to the screen by clicking the three dots next to their name when you click on the participants list. And that'll just show you one view. And lastly, we will be leaving the last 10 minutes for questions. So you can use the raise your hand feature when we move to Q&A, and then I will call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So without further ado, I want to turn to our panelists for introductions. And if you can also share your preferred pronouns. So I'm going to go by how I see everyone on my screen. So I'm going to start with Ray.
Thanks so much. Hey, everyone. Wonderful to be with you. And thank you so much for inviting me to spend a little time with you today. I am Ray Carey, and I am the Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force. I use she and they. And it's just a pleasure to be a part of this. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I'm always interested in what the other participants want us to be talking about.
Perfect. And I'll go to Andres.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andres Wydler, the Executive Director of StartOut, he, him. I guess you already saw me earlier this morning. Thrilled to be here. Super excited about all the wonderful panelists and all the attendees. Very, very briefly, StartOut, we're supporting LGBTQ entrepreneurs, and putting together events like this is not our main focus. Our main focus is to actually help LGBTQ entrepreneurs succeed, accelerate their businesses, and so on. So excited to be here. Thanks very much for joining.
Perfect. And last but not least, Tia.
Great. Hello, my name is Tia Dole. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Chief Clinical Operations Officer of the Trevor Project, meaning that I run our crisis services with my wonderful staff, of course, and I am a clinical psychologist by training who specializes in LGBTQ young people of color.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So to kick off, let's discuss how you've been functioning through these challenging times. If you're like me, this probably feels like season 11 of the year 2020, just that never-ending TV show on NBC. So can you share what these last 9 months have been for you personally, but also as a leader supporting yourself, your organization? So I'm going to start with Tia.
Great. I can say for me personally functioning, it has been a mixed bag. I think you asked personal, and do you want me to do organization at the same time or wait until?
We personally, let's do a little check.
It's been a mixed bag. The wonderful thing is that I don't have to commute, and I've been spending a lot more time with my family members, nuclear family members. We've been social isolating, but I also feel like the workday has extended. And I feel like all the time I spent commuting is now working. And so part of me is like, oh, I wish I could commute so I could stop working sooner and have this transition between work and private life. So, and we're going to be fully remote, I believe, till at least the end of the summer.
Wow. Ray, anything to add?
Yeah, it's been quite a ride. I'm sure I'm not the only one here today who wants 2020 to be over, so we don't have too much longer for that. It's been an intense 9 months, and I'm happy to kind of go into some of this stuff deeper during some of the Q&A and questions. But I think that there have been some pretty deep impacts internally, and we've seen some opportunities and challenges externally. Internally, I think I'm trying to think of the exact date, but let's call it March 15th-ish, 12th, sometime in there. We shut down all of our offices and everyone went remote. As a national organization where we have different offices, we have a DC office, New York, Miami, and then a couple of people who've always worked remote in Minnesota and a couple of other states. It was a big and sudden shift, as I know it was for everyone. but we just immediately had people go remote. And I was pretty conservative on the front end for how long that would be. At first we said, okay, I mean, we were all learning, of course. We're going to plan on this until May or June. And then, come April, we said, okay, actually August. And then actually we shut all of our offices and actually we have everyone worked remotely. But we were fortunate that 2 of our office leases were actually up in September. And I did not want to be paying that much money for what had essentially turned into a storage space. So we have left our main DC office, which was a very large space, and are renting much smaller offices and have the opportunity to scale up when we need to. But it saved us a tremendous amount of money to be able to do that. There are a couple of other things I want to mention that we did. And again, I'm happy to go into more detail at some point. We gave everyone on staff kind of a stipend, if you will, extra money for Wi-Fi at their home to support their Wi-Fi. If they needed office furniture, obviously with our closing of the office, we said, look, if you need a bookshelf, if you need a desk, if you need a chair, come and get it. And so people had access to that. And we've done a couple of other things like that are, benefits or some, things that we've been able to do to support staff in that time. We also made some cultural changes, like an open lunch hour every day at lunch. People could drop into the Zoom and have lunch together or not. It was totally optional. We made some choices around some things to over communicate. So if anyone remembers, what it felt like for our brains in the first few months, it was like a haze. So you might hear something twice and finally understand it on the 4th time. So we made some changes in how we communicate things to our staff to make sure that people were really understanding what we were saying to each other. And then we also held a number of sessions just for people for how it felt. We are a majority people of color organization. So simultaneous with COVID, there were not new, but additional incidents of police violence against Black people, and that really deeply impacts our organization and our staff, along with some of the health disparities that were being surfaced with COVID and just the general climate, if I may say, of white supremacy, given what was going on over the summer. So it really, really impacted our staff in a really deep way, and we provided some space to talk about those things with each other. So those were some of the internal things, and I think, I was part of that ride. I'm part of that ride for the last 9 months of being at home, working at home. Our daughter came home from college quite abruptly and finished the semester, and we're all doing well. And I'm, as a parent, happy to have some extra time with our daughter. As a teenager, she's probably not as happy, but we're all actually doing quite well together. So there are some external things that I'll talk about later, but those are some of the things that really the last 9 months we've implemented and how it's felt.
Thank you for that. Andreas?
Yeah, thank you. I miss people. It's just so weird, right? I mean, I guess, everyone on this call, I'm sure this is no news to anyone. And it's just interesting. We're so much type A, so many of the team and everything else. And I talked to a type P person the other day and said, you know what? This is so great because finally we are on the same playing field because we don't work that same way. But we're pretty much type A people, and I'm type A, obviously. And it's really hard to motivate everyone. Speak a little more to kind of how we're doing, right? Everyone's doing pretty well. I would say pretty well. No one's doing great. So we're kind of made some changes. Obviously, everything turned virtual anyway. Needed to cut the budgets right away. We're doing a lot more now. It's the same budget that we had before, like last year. So there's so much going on, but you don't have that since we're all mission-based, right? All of us, and we're so passionate about what we're doing. Not sharing that passion with anyone other than for some from Zoom windows. It's just not the same. And yep, it's what we got to do. We got to stick to it for a little longer. But yeah, I guess no news to anyone. Yeah, we miss people.
Yeah, and you just mentioned something, being mission based. So I do want to get into the missions and the different organizations that all of you are involved with that have very important missions. So I think, to start with, I'll start with you, Tia. As the person that's overseeing the Trevor Project and the crisis services programs, you've probably seen, I think, firsthand some of the heavy effects of COVID on the LGBT community.
Oh, yeah.
I was hoping, can you share some of your observations and how the Trevor Project has committed to continuing these efforts even in this time of social distance?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think one of the things is actually we conducted a survey of LGBTQ youth pertaining to COVID. So we have information that we gather from our lines, and then we also have information that we gathered from our survey. And essentially, one of the biggest things that we see is that with all the young people who were able to go home, a lot of people, a third of them felt like they had moved back to an unsafe situation, right? And so, I think Ray was saying, she was happy to have, I don't know what your pronouns are. They were happy to have their daughter come home. And that's really exciting. But for a lot of LGBTQ and queer youth, coming home from college is actually a dangerous prospect, and that there's a lot of anguish around it. And we know that like a lot of young people, are feeling more, like 75% of them are starting to feel more anxiety, more lonely than they did at the start of COVID, that their lives are so much more stressful. And that actually there have been a number of young people who, especially folks who identify in the trans or non-binary community, who were not welcomed back home and suddenly found themselves homeless. And so it's interesting because I think one of the things I tend to hear people think about is like, oh gosh, I'm, so isolated, blah, blah, blah. But when you think about LGBTQ young people in particular, there are a lot of dangers with coming back home, and dangers, physical dangers, potentially going back to their towns where they were not safe, but also emotional dangers, which is being misgendered, or having to go back to using a name that they no longer used, or simply one of the things we heard a lot around the election, people being afraid that their family members who, let's say we're a nonprofit as an organization, but their family members might be listening to a specific leader who's calling them out for action, and afraid that their family members were going to harm people of color, harm LGBTQ folks, and that they had to watch this play out in real life. And so it's interesting because we've been talking about COVID, but I think it's been an interesting 9 months. And starting from January, it just sort of has been like this. I would say, like, as a psychologist, I always think of things in stages, and almost like stages of grief that folks have been going through. And then something about that social justice uprising during the summer was so activating, because then, and I hope I'm not talking too long, in the LGBTQ community, there was a bit of a schism, which was Black and brown LGBTQ young people were like, hey, y'all, we're not being allies to us this whole time, and now we need you to step up and understand your privilege as a white LGBTQ person, and standing up for us. And I think it really opened up a lot of conversation, even at Trevor, because we have a lot of LGBTQ young people working at Trevor too, and so there was quite a reckoning over the last few months, and heartbreaking reckoning.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting, you bring up the social justice uprising, and especially around LGBT youth of color, and this is for, question for all of you, but, what are some of those challenges that you've been seeing? Because it is an interesting time for this to happen, right? Because you'd think, with the rules, things that were happening with social distance, it was such an interesting time to see people out on the streets, really making their voices heard.
I'll give someone else a chance to respond.
Any takers?
So sure, yeah. So we obviously work in a very different space, right? Suicide prevention and youth support is very different from entrepreneurial support. So we're in a completely different field. Yet we've seen, what a flight to safety flight to safety in terms of investing, flight to safety in terms of doing business with, which automatically reinforces some of the challenges we've had in the first place. If you're a first-time entrepreneur, flight to safety means you don't get those meetings, you don't get the opportunities you need, because the investment community prefers to do business with people you already know. There is no social space where you can actually interact. They can't get to know each other. As an entrepreneur, you also can't get to know the investors, and so it goes both ways. So it's just gotten a lot harder. I mean, a lot is happening, and someone you said on an earlier panel here, we work so much harder as a community than everyone else. So that worked in our favor. So while the opportunities are lesser, just busting our asses, to be crude here, really led to some businesses doing amazing work and actually doing so much better than others. So I think a lot of them actually proved themselves. So while it was much harder, it was also pretty amazing to see what some of them have done.
And I think for us, first of all, Tia, I could hear you talk all day, so I could listen to you talk all day. So no worry about going on too long. But I think for us in thinking about our mission, and we first and foremost are a racial, economic, gender, and social justice organization that serves the LGBTQ community. And I say that very specifically because the way that my organization, the National LGBTQ Task Force, enters into an issue is through that lens, right? And so, for example, in things like we do a lot of democracy work, voting rights, census, which I'll talk a little bit about more in a minute. But, when we were looking at democracy this year and voting rights and seeing the racially based voter suppression again and again and again, after, for example, having won back the right to vote for over 4 million returning citizens in the state of Florida who had been previously incarcerated, and then watching the Florida legislature try to do all sorts of ridiculous things, basically poll taxes. And then just the fears around voting in the context of COVID, right? So I appreciate, Tia, the roads that you were going down and what you were talking, because it's like, it is the intersection of the experience. It's not like, okay, there's police violence here, there's voting here, and there's the rest of my life here, right? Like we're all whole people. And so the way that we do our work, inclusive of now adapting to COVID, is from that standpoint that each of us shouldn't divide ourselves every day, right? We can't be a woman one day and a mom the next, and Latinx the next, and bisexual the next, right? We're all of those things all the time. And so I think, this concept of safety, so many people in the LGBT community never feel safe. There's no place that really feels safe. And Tia spoke to the experiences of young people, but when we think about seniors who are maybe either had to go back and live with family, are in assisted living programs or nursing homes, and maybe trying to be out, maybe not, and then having the overlay of COVID. So it's, again, all these intersections where we're seeing that happen. In terms of a couple of adaptations, we really had to do a quick turnaround on some things. We ran the LGBTQ outreach for the United States Census. Turns out there are actually a number of friendly people at the US Census Bureau. And we've been working with them actually for a long time, for well over a decade. And so we ran that, and we had a whole plan to fan out around the nation, knock on doors, get hand things out. And obviously we couldn't do that with COVID. Interestingly, I think we ended up being able to reach more people electronically than we might have thought to do. So there's, that's kind of I wouldn't necessarily say there are many silver linings, but there are ways of doing outreach that we might have done some of before, but we're really able to go full bore on. Same with getting out the vote, turning our census project into our getting out the vote work. Even with all the barriers thrown up to vote this year, we're able to reach a lot of people through that. And so, when we think about and some of the key issues affecting our community, health disparities, they became, if they weren't already so visible and so obvious, they became even more visible and more obvious this year. And so again, I think it's just looking at when, and even for those of you who are on as attendees of this summit, thinking about the people that you're working with as whole people and what might be their needs or the things that are impacting them, even if you are in a very specific type of relationship with them as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and Ray, I read this study recently about, and you touched a little bit on this, but the effects of COVID-19 specifically on Black LGBT youth and just the transgender community definitely bigger than the effects on someone that's more privileged, cis, white, heterosexual, cis, white, and male in the LGBT community. But what are your observations? How has, I know that the task force does a lot of advocacy work. How have you shifted those operations for that group, and how do you continue that work?
Well, I think it's as much a matter of giving voice to what you just talked about as it is the kind of advocacy work this year has been odd because it's an election year, and we've been chugging away on a number of things with Congress and in partnership with states around the country, but it's an election year, right? And everybody's attention was focused on that. But I think, what we're seeing, and we'll get more and more data on, is so many people in our community, particularly trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, people of color, already faced barriers to appropriate supportive healthcare, right? For both financial reasons, but also because can they be out to their provider? Can they even get to a provider? And so already so many in our community may already have some pre-existing conditions or some health conditions that then exacerbate the issue if they're exposed to COVID, as we all know. So I think that it's this layering of disparities, discrimination, fear of discrimination that's very based in reality. And then many in our community working as essential workers, whether it's in grocery stores or in hospitals, and the exposure there, and still not being able to get the healthcare that they need if they're, working some of the jobs where they don't have as easy access to healthcare. So, I think in looking at our work, we always try to surface the experiences that are based on economic issues, racial injustice, and then from there, try to shape policy.
I think you brought up something really interesting, Ray, which is thinking about how one's intersectional identities interact together, but there are times when one takes precedence over the other. And it's such an interesting dynamic because I think for youth of color, especially, I always talk about young folks of color over the summer. I do think that in some ways that was a time where sort of belonging to their ethnic group took precedence over their LGBTQ identity. What was interesting, especially being very familiar with the Black and Brown communities, that there was also an opening up of the eyes in the Black community to accept LGBTQ folks in a different way, especially trans folks. And so it's interesting because as horrible as the last 9 months have been, to me, there's been so much progress. And the way I tend to think about 2020 is like 1998, that we're living through history, and that sort of this is a really transformative year that I feel in some ways very lucky to be an adult in. And I think, and I won't go on and on, I'm sorry, but I also think that this has been an interesting year of seeing sort of the millennial and below, whatever's below them, generation, where folks had a lot of negative thoughts or assumptions about this generation really take up the mantle of social justice in a way that my generation as a middle-aged Black woman was not able to do. And I think it's been really beautiful to see the way that they have been holding that up and being not with us, not this generation. And I really love seeing them take the power.
I would love to build on that too. It's I'm an eternal optimist as an entrepreneur, of course. It's hopeless, but there's some amazing silver linings this year that we experienced. And one is the incredible focus of our partners, of our sponsors, of the boards. Everyone 100% in agreement. We want, can, and will do more for our people of color. And all our entrepreneurs, all our beneficiaries are LGBTQ entrepreneurs, right? We only serve that sector. That's all we do. But within, of course, there's huge differences. And I think we've made major progress. It's been always part of our goal for the whole 11 years of been in existence, but now it's just accelerated so much. So I'm very optimistic that this has staying power, and we just had some incredibly successful entrepreneurs of color. We're thrilled to showcase if it works out, and so it just, there's so much positive coming out of this. As horrendous as this year has been, as painful as it's been emotionally on all levels, I think we all learning a lot as well. That we all can do more and will do more.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, while we're with you, Andres, I personally know that StartOut is an organization that thrives on interactions, networking, bringing LGBT entrepreneurs across the board in contact and into those offices with investors and mentors. So, while you were talking, I was thinking, how have you continued these efforts despite these challenges? And what can we see in the future coming from that?
So thanks for the question. I mean, we're in actually about 5 years ago, we were so much focused on impact and measuring impact and trying to figure out not just having wonderful, happy clients or beneficiaries, but see, does that what we do really matter? And so we launched a whole Startup Project Economic Impact Index, a major research project to measure both the contributions, but also the unrealized potential, which is really the most exciting part of our community. That's going on. That's a longer term project. But shorter term, over the last 5 years, we built pretty much all our services, with the exception of the events. We built them online. So we are already a virtual organization. So fortunately, we were prepared to actually make that happen. And then on the event side, all our programming boards throughout the country, they're wonderful, and they turned on a dime and made things happen right away. So it's truly awesome to see. But everywhere throughout, back to the opportunity to foster more intersectionality, we got more inbound interest as well from groups that are not LGBTQ, but would like us to help with their diversity efforts. So we see, and that can be major brands, it can be accelerators, it can be other groups, nonprofits or for-profits, who cater to a specific group. So we see that inbound interest as an incredible opportunity to do more partnering. So it goes both ways. So a lot of positive comes out of that, where we can build. We just have to be super smart about how to put meat on the bone of all those partnerships.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and so I do want to leave some time for questions, but in the spirit of staying optimistic, right, of the hope that we can have and all the good work that has come out from this experience, how can we stay engaged and support the LGBT community? What are some ways that we can rise to these challenges? And, keeping in mind that one of the things I always say is I really never want the conversation to stop. Sometimes I feel like people will get really pumped up. You'll start seeing all what I sometimes call performative allyship, where you'll see the squares, but then the conversation stops. And I truly believe that it needs to continue. So what are some ways you think that we can do this? And that's for all of you.
Genesis, I want to follow up on kind of your lead on that, to say, one of my fears is that people won't engage, won't continue to engage, particularly white LGBTQ people, white people in general. And I say that because everyone is exhausted. Everyone's exhausted. And, we happen to be a more politically focused organization. We are nonpartisan as well, like Trevor Project. And I will say we are happy to have a more LGBTQ friendly administration coming in, because we can regain what we lost during the last 4 years that we had gained the previous 8 years. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot that the LGBTQ community has to offer to the country. And the resilience, depending on your age, whether it was living through the early years of the AIDS crisis or being an LGBTQ person of color or trans person, like there's so much resilience. And so I think we have a lot to share, and there are a lot of needs, right? I mean, just the mental health challenges that have been either created or exacerbated by the last 9 months. I think that our community, I mean, we have built entire infrastructures for our community when the government would not, right? And so there's a lot that we have to teach about making it through crises, and what creativity, what innovation is a perfect, group of folks to be talking about innovation, because I think there are going to be a lot of innovations that come out of this time that will stick, right? Both personally and professionally, if you will, right? I attended, unfortunately, a Shiva online, but there were people from all over the world that never would have been able to mourn together, right? I have a feeling some version of that will stick. And how we're thinking about our work and the boundaries of our work. And for entrepreneurs, where do your employees come from? Well, guess what? Maybe they don't always have to come from, it's the place where you have an office. And we've known that before, but I think we're getting real life experience of what that actually means and any kind of accommodations and adaptations we have to make. So I have a lot of hope, and we're going to have to stay on it, right? Just because Biden and Harris were elected doesn't mean like, oh, phew, we can no longer deal with racism. We can no longer deal with the economic issue. We actually have to double down. And it may take a minute for everyone to get their breath and rest up to be able to double down, but we've got to do it.
I have some thoughts about this, which is I was giving a grand rounds yesterday, and I was talking to the residents. And they were like, well, how do we stand up to the attendings, to the lead doctors when they do microaggressions, since we have no power? And I was like, that's such a great question. And what I said to them is what I would say to this question, which is that folks have to understand that change is uncomfortable and that you're not always going to do it from a place of safety. And I think Ray is making such a great point. People are exhausted, but what they're experiencing is a sliver of what POCs, LGBTQ people have been experiencing their entire lives. Welcome. And so what I want folks to do, especially white folks, cisgender folks, is to understand like things will have to get more uncomfortable for things to change, and to understand that like being an ally, which people have been saying, being an ally is no longer an adjective, it's a verb, but it's a verb, it's an action that has to happen in discomfort, where you're pushing yourself past where you would have gone normally because you don't want to offend anybody. So when you hear someone misgendering someone, when you hear someone make a comment, even in a family setting, be like, that's not okay. Americans are so concerned with being polite that they allow microaggressions to continue. And I think that those kind of things come together to put especially LGBTQ youth at risk, because they hear those comments in their, in Thanksgiving. And then they feel terrible about themselves. So I think it's really understanding that more discomfort is to come.
I would like to add something to wonderful comments. They go deep, 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 and you're obviously a psychologist, and I'm not. I'm a businessman, so completely different perspective. But I think to Ray's point as well on what could go away, it behooves us to change as well, all of us, and to make it super easy to continue the enthusiasm. Yes, we're exhausted, we're tired, and so on, but it's also exciting to see how we can help. And so we just have to provide all the technology platforms, communication, everything, make it super easy, make it smooth, make it enjoyable, make it fun, right? To continue to work. And that's really, I think, so much is out there. We just can't do the same job as we did before. Things have changed. We want to go with the change. And there, I think, tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, this is amazing. And it's funny because when you think about it, this session was around challenges of the LGBTQ community during COVID-19, right? But it's interesting that it turns into this social political conversation, because this year was, I feel, a year where a lot of things came to light. Maybe it's because we were home the whole time. You have time to think about this, and there was a restlessness. So it's so interesting that I just, looking at what we talked about, that it did shift and touch all gears. So I do want to leave time for questions. And I see that folks have been putting things into the chat. So I'm going to start actually with this first question. Tia, this is for you. So what started your interest and commitment to helping and supporting youth?
I would say I started working, it's interesting, I started as a trainee, and I have like a really high risk tolerance. And so what happened is I started seeing very suicidal people, and I would get all the clients that nobody else would take. And what happened was people would be like, Tia, can you please take this person? They just made a really serious suicide. And so I actually, and because LGBTQ young people are such high risk for suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors, I had like 50% of my caseload would always be in the queer community. I got specialized training because of it. And I also was always horrified. I always thought of them as like refugees from other clinicians, where I was like, people said that to you? Or I'd always be really shocked. So I kind of ended up working with young people, especially in the queer community, because of my risk tolerance, and my comfort of being like, how suicidal are you? Is it time to go into the hospital? No, not yet. Great. And that's really hard to do as a clinician, because most people will just send you to the ER, and even if you mention something, so then people keep to themselves until it's too late. And I like working with young people because they're more open than old people to grow and change, and you can help them more. The work is faster in a lot of ways.
Thank you for that. All right, so we have another question here. I believe this is for all of you. So do you believe that people aren't speaking up for the sake of being polite, or because of fear to maybe say the wrong thing or stand up to/for others?
Or see all of the above, right?
Yeah.
I think it's there are so many reasons depending on who you are and what your perspective and experience is, and also if you have taken a risk, to say something before and how you've been treated in taking that risk, right? How people have responded to you. And I think, particularly for organizations and companies, making it part and parcel of the work of the company to attend to how race plays out in the company, right? How race plays out in your sector. There have obviously been many articles. I'm not probably saying too much that's new, except that's going to be my T-shirt. Tia, more discomfort is to come, right? And I think that taking that risk and having a partner in taking that risk, right, is important, right? So if you're a white person and you want to have a conversation with someone, who are other white people you're going to, say, I'm scared to do this, and, talk it through me, or, whatever. So I think it's having partners. But I also think there are real fears in how people treat each other, particularly in this increasingly polarized climate. And it's about having curiosity, right? And asking questions and trying not to make assumptions, so that there can be a conversation and not just a telling to each other.
I agree 100%. Go ahead.
I have nothing intelligent to add to all this. It's an incredibly tough question, because you never really know in the end. You don't want to make assumptions. It's equally dangerous to make assumptions about others as it is about yourself. And so, yeah, I think it's a very tough question. Unfortunately, I'm no expert on this.
Well, it's sort of like cheating, right? There's a million reasons why people cheat, right? There's never just one. And it's usually like an intersection of factors. I always come up that have weird analogies, but I think that there are lots of reasons why people don't speak up. Their own personal dynamics, the group dynamics that they're involved in, their larger community, where, let's say they're in a super religious community. If they were to speak up, they would actually put other people at risk and their family members. There's lots of reasons. But my hope is that, and I am an eternal optimist, or else I wouldn't be a psychologist as well. So I can join you on that. But my hope is that folks can take small opportunities to take risks to protect people who can't protect themselves, or amplify voices that don't have anybody as a champion. And not that nobody's a hero here, but it really is about looking out for other people in a way that we haven't been doing.
Definitely. And so I think we have time for one more question. And Tia, I think your analogies are inspiring people. We have a question here that I'd actually like to apply for you and Ray. So do you have any advice for someone wishing to take a similar path to yourself? Any advice to get into that?
I sort of missed the question.
And
what was the question again?
Sorry. So it's like, so do you have any advice for someone wishing to take a similar path to yourself? And this person's asking more specifically around LGBT advocacy and charity. Yeah.
Oh, so I'm a clinical psychologist, so I kind of went the clinical path, but you can be a psychologist, you can be a social worker, you can do family therapy. And this, I think it really is just like, I would say, getting involved early in a organization like the ones here on the panel. Really it's just like, oftentimes we have to make a decision between being able to support yourself versus working for a nonprofit. And that's the challenge. And I think that's the challenge. So what usually happens is that only people with means end up working in nonprofits because they have family members who supplement their income. Don't let me get started on that. But I will say that there are also ways that you can volunteer. Trevor has volunteers. I'm sure other organizations have volunteers. So there's like lots of different avenues. You can do professional, you can do clinical, you can do volunteerism. There are lots of different ways you can get involved.
Ray, Andreas, anything else to add?
Just that, for folks who are part of this session or maybe watching it later, I think figure out something that you're passionate about, and you don't have to like go all in. I mean, unless you want to, you can change your career, whatever. But so many organizations need good board members. Mm-hmm. So many organizations need volunteers for mm-hmm. events, whether they're virtual or eventually in person. And I think, kind of what are the bite-sized pieces that you can take off and get involved in an organization, offer your expertise. The nonprofit sector as a whole is a risk-averse sector for a variety of reasons. And many of the folks who are a part of this session today, you are risk takers, you are entrepreneurs, and you have skill sets that might be incredibly valuable to local, state, or national organizations. A few I would recommend either on the local or state level are to look up our Centerlink. It is the umbrella organization for all of the LGBTQ community centers. Some are very tiny, some are much larger. And then there's the state equality organizations. And the umbrella for that is the Equality Federation, in addition to the many organizations. I'm a huge fan of the Trevor Project. So, there are many, many organizations that you can get involved in.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
I guess our time's up. I just want to add
We're getting kicked off.
A personal comment. Like, it's the best decision of my life to join a nonprofit. Just follow my passion. Everything has changed, and I if someone really is passionate about it, give it a shot. It can be absolutely amazing. That's all I want to say.
Oh, Genesis, you're on mute.
I love that the technical difficulties start at the end. So I was just going to say a big thank you to our panelists for their participation, to all of the attendees for taking time to share in this conversation. Really hope you enjoyed the session today, and we'll see you back in general session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.